Benjamin Reed was not a man easily swayed by appearances. As one of the youngest and most successful tech magnates in New York City, he had learned early on that what people presented on the surface often masked deeper truths. It was this instinct that had made him suspicious of his fiancée's family, the Thompsons. Grace Thompson, a prominent attorney from a family renowned for their philanthropy, seemed perfect in every way. They were the kind of people who were frequently featured in glossy magazine spreads, donating to charities, hosting events for underprivileged children, and rubbing shoulders with the city's elite. But something about the Thompsons always felt rehearsed to Benjamin, like actors sticking to a script that hid their true nature. And as the wedding date loomed closer, that nagging doubt gnawed at him more each day. It all came to a head one evening, after yet another lavish charity event hosted by Grace's family. The event had been spectacular, filled with warm speeches and generous donations, but Benjamin noticed a fleeting moment when the smile on Grace's face vanished, revealing a cold, indifferent look that sent a chill down his spine. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was a glimpse of something real, something the polished facade was designed to hide. That night, unable to sleep, Benjamin made a decision that would test the authenticity of the people he was about to marry into. He knew Grace's family was hosting an exclusive dinner in 2 weeks, gathering the city's most influential people at their private estate. The event was planned to be an intimate affair. No cameras, no press, just the elite and those who served them. It was the perfect opportunity. Benjamin arranged with a trusted friend to pose as a recruiter for a high-end staffing agency and got himself placed as one of the temporary waitstaff for the event. If he wanted the truth, he needed to see how Grace and her family behaved when they thought no one important was watching. On the day of the event, Benjamin exchanged his tailored suit for the crisp white shirt and black vest of a waiter. As he arrived at the Thompson estate, he could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He was stepping into unknown territory, not just for answers, but potentially to expose a reality he wasn't sure he was prepared to face. The estate was even more opulent up close, an architectural masterpiece nestled in lush gardens. Guests started arriving, and Benjamin moved among them, unnoticed in his new role. He watched carefully as the Thompsons greeted their guests with wide smiles, effortlessly charming everyone who walked through the grand entrance. But as the night unfolded, it became clear that this world of elegance was only skin-deep. Benjamin, blending into the background, overheard snippets of conversation laced with veiled arrogance and subtle dismissals. It was in these casual interactions that the cracks began to show. The warmth that the Thompsons so publicly radiated seemed to fade when dealing with those they considered beneath them. As the evening progressed, Benjamin's eyes were constantly drawn to Grace. At the head of the table, she was every bit the poised hostess, laughing lightly, making polite conversation, and ensuring everyone felt at ease. But when the topic turned to social issues, a fleeting moment of disinterest crossed her face. And then, during a quiet lull in conversation, one of her cousins made a snide remark about the help, and Grace, without hesitation, laughed along as if it was the most natural response in the world. Benjamin felt a knot tighten in his chest. This wasn't the Grace he knew, or thought he knew. The woman who had passionately argued about equality and justice suddenly seemed comfortable turning a blind eye when it didn't serve her directly. It was subtle, but in that laugh, in that moment of shared mockery, Benjamin glimpsed a side of her that she had never shown him. He couldn't confront her, not yet. The night was far from over, and Benjamin needed more than just a gut feeling. He needed to see how far this act would go and what it would reveal about the people he was about to tie his future to. But with every passing minute, the carefully constructed world around him started to unravel. And for the first time, Benjamin wondered if this truth he was so determined to find might be one he couldn't unsee. The following days felt like a blur for Benjamin, filled with a growing sense of unease that he couldn't shake. His mind kept replaying that night at the estate, dissecting every interaction, every glance, and every word exchanged by Grace and her family. He knew he was treading on dangerous ground. What he was doing could destroy everything they had built together. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had no choice. He needed to know the truth, no matter the cost. The day of the dinner arrived, and Benjamin felt a strange mix of dread and determination as he dressed in his waiter's uniform. He had become a master at navigating high-pressure situations in his professional life, but this was different. This was personal. As he buttoned up the vest, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. Gone was the confident billionaire, replaced by someone far more vulnerable, someone about to step into a role that might change his life forever. The Thompson estate was a hive of activity when he arrived. Staff bustled about, preparing for the evening, setting tables with fine china and arranging fresh flowers. Benjamin blended in seamlessly, his presence barely acknowledged by those around him. He was just another face in the sea of workers, an observer in his own life. As guests began to arrive, Benjamin moved with practiced ease, carrying trays of champagne and canapes, silently observing everything. The elite of New York's social scene trickled in, each one greeted with the same dazzling smiles from Grace and her family. From his vantage point, Benjamin could see the ease with which they slipped into their roles, the way their faces lit up with charm and politeness. But he was no longer fooled by the superficial glow. As the evening unfolded, Benjamin positioned himself in strategic spots, listening in on conversations that he was never meant to hear. It didn't take long for the masks to slip, revealing the true nature of the people he was surrounded by. He overheard one of Grace's uncles dismiss a charity they supported publicly, calling it a good PR move, but nothing more. Another relative casually remarked about how tiresome it was to attend these events, but necessary to keep up appearances. It was clear that this was not just a family of philanthropists. They were strategists, carefully curating their public image while privately harboring disdain for the very causes they claimed to support. Benjamin felt a growing pit in his stomach as the hypocrisy unfolded before his eyes. His thoughts kept returning to Grace. The woman he loved was at the center of all this, and he was desperate to believe that she was different. He needed to see her away from her family, to watch her in moments where she wasn't performing for an audience. He hoped, prayed, that the Grace he knew would emerge when she wasn't under the influence of her relatives. Then came the moment he'd been dreading. As he approached the main dining room to refill drinks, he saw Grace standing by the window, speaking quietly with her mother, Evelyn Thompson. Their voices were low, but Benjamin edged closer, pretending to adjust a table setting nearby. "I just don't understand why we have to keep doing these things," Grace was saying, her voice carrying a note of frustration. "It's exhausting, and sometimes it feels so fake." Evelyn, ever the poised matriarch, placed a hand on Grace's shoulder and smiled softly. "It's part of who we are, darling. People expect it from us. And besides, it's good for your image, especially with the wedding coming up. Benjamin's world is different from ours. He might not understand how these things work." Benjamin froze, his hand tightening around the tray he was holding. Grace's words were a flicker of hope. Perhaps she wasn't as entrenched in this charade as the rest of her family. But Evelyn's response sent a shiver down his spine. It was as if everything was calculated, every move, every word, designed to maintain their carefully constructed world. And in that world, Benjamin realized he was nothing more than another piece of the puzzle. He backed away quietly, his mind racing. He needed to get closer, to see how Grace would act when the spotlight wasn't on her. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. Later that evening, as the guests mingled over dessert, Grace slipped away from the main room, clearly needing a moment alone. Benjamin followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention. He found her in the garden, standing by the fountain, lost in thought. He approached her cautiously, his heart pounding. As he got closer, he deliberately let his footstep crunch on the gravel path, alerting her to his presence. Grace turned, startled at first, but then relaxed when she saw it was just a waiter. "I'm sorry, miss," Benjamin said, keeping his voice low and respectful. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I was just making my rounds." Grace smiled faintly, a touch of warmth in her eyes that he hadn't seen all evening. "It's all right. I needed a break from all that," she said, gesturing back toward the house. "Sometimes it all feels a bit much, you know." Benjamin nodded, his throat tight. "It must be hard, always being in the spotlight." She sighed, her gaze drifting back to the fountain. "It is, but it's what's expected of me." Of all of us. She paused, then added softly, but sometimes I wonder if I'm losing myself in it. Benjamin felt a surge of emotion, wanting nothing more than to drop the pretense and tell her who he was, to reach out and hold her, to reassure her that she wasn't alone. But he couldn't, not yet. He was still in his role, still needing to see how far this would go. "You seem like someone who values being true to yourself," he said, choosing his words carefully. "That's not something to lose easily." Grace looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find something familiar. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means a lot." Before Benjamin could respond, they were interrupted by one of the guests calling Grace back inside. She glanced at Benjamin once more, giving him a small, sincere smile before turning to leave. As he watched her walk away, Benjamin's resolve only strengthened. He had seen a glimpse of the woman he loved, the woman who might still be there, buried under layers of expectation and pressure. But to find out if that was the real Grace, he would have to dig deeper. And as the night continued, Benjamin knew he was on the path to uncovering a truth that could either save their relationship or shatter it completely. As the evening progressed, Benjamin's anticipation turned into a gnawing anxiety. He continued his role as a silent observer, watching the interactions around him with a scrutinizing eye. Every laugh, every smile, every seemingly benign exchange was another piece of the puzzle, revealing the true character of the Thompsons and their circle. He was hoping against hope that what he was beginning to see was all a misunderstanding. But as the night wore on, it became harder to convince himself of that. The dinner was in full swing now, the dining room filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of fine china. Benjamin moved through the room, offering wine refills and clearing plates, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible while listening intently. The more he heard, the more his unease grew. It started subtly, with the small, offhand comments that might have been overlooked by someone less attentive. One of the guests, an older man who was a close friend of Grace's father, scoffed at the idea of the new charity initiative that Grace had spearheaded. "All this fuss about education for underprivileged kids," the man said, rolling his eyes as he sipped his wine. "It's a noble cause, I suppose, but really, what's the point? Most of them won't amount to anything. It's just good PR for the family." The words hit Benjamin like a punch to the gut. He knew Grace was passionate about the project, or at least she had always spoken about it that way. But here, in this room, it was reduced to nothing more than a marketing strategy, a tool to polish the Thompson family's already shiny reputation. Grace sat only a few seats away, perfectly composed as she listened to the conversation. She didn't react, didn't defend her initiative, just smiled politely and took another sip of her wine. The indifference in her demeanor made Benjamin's heart sink. Was this really who she was when she wasn't with him? As the courses continued, Benjamin's tray grew heavier with the weight of the dishes and his mounting doubts. Each comment, each dismissive laugh, added to his growing disillusionment. The family he had admired from a distance, the people he had hoped would become his own, were revealing themselves to be very different from what they appeared to be. Then came the moment that made Benjamin's blood run cold. He was clearing plates near the end of the table when he overheard a conversation between Evelyn Thompson, Grace's mother, and a younger woman who was a distant cousin. They were discussing one of the servers, a young woman who had accidentally spilled a drop of wine on the tablecloth earlier in the evening. The incident had been minor, barely noticeable, and the server had quickly apologized and cleaned it up. But Evelyn's voice was sharp as she spoke, her words laced with venom. "These people, they just don't understand decorum. You give them a job, and they think it's an invitation to behave like they belong here. It's pathetic, really." The younger woman giggled in agreement. "I know, right? You'd think they'd have the decency to stay out of sight after something like that. Honestly, who hires these people?" Benjamin felt a surge of anger as he watched them, their perfectly manicured hands casually dismissing a person's worth as if it were nothing. He had seen this server earlier, a young woman barely out of her teens, working diligently with a nervous energy that spoke volumes about how much she needed this job. And yet here she was, reduced to a punchline in a conversation between people who never had to worry about such things. He glanced over at Grace, who was deep in conversation with another guest. She hadn't heard her mother's words, but Benjamin wondered if it would have mattered if she had. Would she have stood up for the girl, or would she have just smiled and let it slide, like she had with the others? As he continued to clear the table, Benjamin's mind raced. He couldn't deny what he was seeing any longer. The Thompsons, for all their philanthropy and charm, held a deep-seated belief that they were above others, that their wealth and status gave them the right to look down on those who weren't like them. And Grace, the woman he loved, was either blind to it or complicit in it. He found himself in the kitchen, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as he tried to steady himself. The reality of what he was witnessing was more than just a disappointment. It was a betrayal of everything he thought he knew. This family wasn't just flawed. They were hypocritical, upholding a public image that was the exact opposite of their private attitudes. Benjamin knew that he couldn't keep this charade up for much longer. The truth was there, laid bare in front of him, and it was ugly. But the question that haunted him now was whether he could ever look at Grace the same way again. Could he confront her with what he had seen? Would she even understand? Or would she brush it off, just like the rest of her family had brushed off the people who served them? His thoughts were interrupted by the head of the catering staff, who tapped him on the shoulder. "Hey, we need you back out there to help with the dessert. Can you manage?" Benjamin nodded, forcing himself to focus. "Yeah, I'm on it." He grabbed the tray of desserts, his mind still spinning, and walked back out to the dining room. As he approached the table, he saw Grace laughing at something one of the guests had said, her smile radiant and effortless. She looked happy, carefree, like nothing in the world could disturb her peace. But Benjamin knew better now. He knew that behind that smile, behind the perfect exterior, was a woman who might not be the person he thought she was. And as he served the desserts, he realized that his own peace was slipping away, piece by piece. As the night drew on, Benjamin's calm demeanor began to fray at the edges. He moved mechanically through his tasks, serving dessert, pouring coffee, all the while grappling with the turmoil swirling inside him. The duality of the evening, the glitz and glamour of the event versus the ugliness he had witnessed, was suffocating. Every glance he cast toward Grace was now tinged with doubt and confusion. She looked as she always did, graceful, poised, the very picture of elegance. But that image now clashed violently with the reality Benjamin was beginning to accept. He had fallen in love with her, believing her to be different, believing that she shared the values she so often spoke about. But tonight, that belief was unraveling with each passing moment. It wasn't just the hypocrisy of her family that weighed on him. It was the way Grace had seamlessly blended into it, laughing at inappropriate jokes, ignoring the dismissive remarks made by her relatives, and failing to stand up for the values she claimed to hold dear. The woman he had seen in the garden earlier, the one who had expressed doubt and fatigue over her role in this world, now seemed like a ghost, fleeting and insubstantial. As he collected empty dessert plates, Benjamin's thoughts spiraled. Could he really have been so blind? Was this the real Grace? Had he been so caught up in his own ideals that he missed the signs? Or was there still hope that she was simply playing along, too conditioned by her upbringing to break away in this setting? The doubts gnawed at him, and with them came a creeping sense of dread. Benjamin had always been a man who prided himself on his ability to see through people, to read situations and react accordingly. But here he was, on the cusp of what should have been the happiest time of his life, questioning everything he thought he knew about the woman he was about to marry. The final straw came as the evening began to wind down. The guests were slowly making their way toward the exit, saying their goodbyes, when Benjamin overheard a conversation that crystallized everything he had been feeling. Grace was speaking with her father, Charles Thompson, near the doorway. Benjamin, clearing a nearby table, couldn't help but overhear. "Grace, your speech earlier was impeccable, as always," Charles said, his voice filled with fatherly pride. "You're going to make an excellent addition to our legacy." Grace smiled, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Hesitation, perhaps? "Thanks, Dad. But sometimes I wonder if we're doing enough, if what we're doing actually makes a difference." Charles chuckled lightly, dismissing her concerns with a wave of his hand. "Grace, we do plenty. More than most people in our position. You've done more than enough. And besides, it's not just about making a difference. It's about maintaining who we are, what we represent. The Thompson name stands for something, and you've upheld that beautifully. Grace nodded, but Benjamin saw the doubt in her eyes deepen. Yet she didn't argue, didn't push back. Instead, she simply smiled and squeezed her father's arm affectionately, as if accepting his words as truth. Benjamin's heart sank. There was laid bare Grace's compliance. Her willingness to go along with what her family represented was undeniable. She wasn't ignorant of the contradictions. She was complicit in them. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or a desire to please her family, she was part of the very machine that he had grown to despise over the course of the evening. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about Grace's family. It was about her too. She was part of this world, molded by it, and she wasn't about to break away from it for anyone, not even for him. Benjamin felt a wave of nausea as he turned away from the scene, retreating back into the shadows of the dining room. The bustling activity of the cleanup crew provided a stark contrast to the stillness inside him. His chest tightened, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him like a vice. He needed to get out, to escape the stifling atmosphere of the Thompson estate before he suffocated under the weight of his own doubts and fears. But even as he moved toward the kitchen, ready to leave, he knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. He had come here for the truth, and now that he had it, he had to decide what to do with it. Should he confront Grace? Tell her what he had seen, what he had heard, and demand an explanation? Or should he simply walk away, leave her and this entire world behind, and never look back? The thought of losing Grace, of walking away from the life they had planned together, tore at him. But the thought of marrying her, knowing what he knew now, was equally unbearable. He was caught between two impossible choices, and both paths seemed destined to lead to heartbreak. As he leaned against the wall in the quiet of the kitchen, the noise of the cleanup fading into the background, Benjamin closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He needed clarity, needed to decide his next move. But all he could see were the faces of the Thompsons, their smiles masking the truth he could no longer ignore. In that moment, Benjamin realized that the decision he was about to make would change everything. It wasn't just about Grace or her family anymore. It was about who he was and what he was willing to accept. And as the weight of that decision settled on him, he knew there was no turning back. Benjamin's hands trembled slightly as he wiped them on the dish towel, trying to steady his nerves. The decision he had been avoiding all night was now inevitable. He couldn't leave without confronting Grace, without giving her the chance to explain, to see if there was anything left of the woman he thought he knew. He needed answers, needed to hear from her directly, away from the prying eyes of her family. As the last of the guests trickled out and the estate fell into a calm lull, Benjamin saw his opportunity. Grace had just finished saying goodbye to the final guest, her smile faltering slightly as the door closed. She turned back into the foyer, her shoulders dropping as if a heavy burden had been lifted. But the burden Benjamin carried was still weighing heavily on him. Now was the time. He followed her into the study, a room adorned with dark wood paneling and lined with leather-bound books. It was one of the few places in the house that felt somewhat private, secluded from the rest of the sprawling mansion. Grace moved to the sideboard and poured herself a glass of wine, her back to him. "Grace," Benjamin began, his voice strained. She turned at the sound of his voice, a surprised look crossing her face. "We need to talk." She set down her glass, her brows knitting together in concern as she stepped closer. "Ben, what's wrong? You look upset." It took all of Benjamin's willpower not to blurt out everything at once. He had to stay calm, focused if he was going to get the truth. "I've been here all night, Grace," he said, his voice low. "I've seen everything, heard everything." Grace's expression shifted to one of confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Seen what?" Benjamin sighed, running a hand through his hair as he gathered his thoughts. "I wasn't just a guest tonight. I was here as one of the waitstaff." He watched as her confusion turned to shock. "I needed to know the truth, to see if what I suspected was real." Grace's face paled, and she took a step back, her hand instinctively clutching the back of a chair for support. "Ben, what are you saying? Why would you do that?" Because I had to know, he replied, his voice hardening. I had to know if your family, if you were who you claimed to be. And what I found, he shook his head, unable to finish the thought. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Ben, I don't understand. What did you see? Benjamin's heart pounded in his chest, the moment of truth finally upon him. I saw your family for who they really are, Grace. The way they talk about people, the way they look down on anyone who isn't like them. The hypocrisy, the cruelty, it's all there, right beneath the surface. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but Benjamin pressed on, the words tumbling out in a rush. And you, Grace, you just stood there, smiling, laughing along with them. You didn't say anything, didn't stand up for what's right. You were a part of it, just like they are. She looked stricken, her eyes filling with tears. Ben, it's not like that. You don't understand. Then make me understand, he demanded, his voice rising. Tell me why you didn't speak up. Tell me why you let them treat people like they're nothing. Grace's voice trembled as she spoke. It's complicated, Ben. My family, they've always been like this. It's the world I grew up in, the world I know. And yes, sometimes I don't agree with them, but it's hard to go against them. It's hard to be different. That's not an excuse, Grace, Benjamin shot back, his anger flaring. You told me you cared about these things, that you wanted to make a difference. But tonight you just stood there and did nothing. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of his words hanging between them. Grace looked away, tears spilling down her cheeks. You don't know what it's like, Ben. You don't know how hard it is to be part of this family, to live up to their expectations. I try, I really do, but sometimes I just feel trapped. Benjamin's anger began to cool, replaced by a deep sadness. He could see the conflict in her, the war between who she wanted to be and who she felt she had to be. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Grace, he said softly, his voice laced with pain, I love you. But I can't be with someone who doesn't stand up for what's right, who doesn't have the courage to be true to themselves. I thought you were different. I needed you to be different. Her eyes met his, filled with desperation. Ben, please don't do this. I'm trying. I can change. I will change. Just give me a chance. Benjamin looked at her, the woman he had fallen in love with, and felt his heart break. He wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to the hope that things could be different. But the image of her laughing along with her family, of her turning a blind eye to their behavior, was burned into his mind. He took a deep breath, his decision made. I can't, Grace. Not like this. The words hung in the air, final and unyielding. Grace's face crumpled as she realized what he was saying. Ben, no, please. But Benjamin knew it was too late. Too much had been revealed. Too many illusions shattered. He turned and walked toward the door, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was leaving behind. As he reached the doorway, he paused, looking back at her one last time. I hope you find the strength to be the person you want to be, Grace. But I can't wait around to see if that happens. With that, he walked out, leaving her standing alone in the study, the echoes of their broken relationship lingering in the stillness of the night. The cold night air hit Benjamin like a wave as he stepped outside the Thompson estate, the door closing softly behind him. The warmth and opulence of the evening seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the confrontation that had just taken place. His heart was heavy, a painful throbbing in his chest as he walked down the stone steps, the gravel crunching under his shoes. He paused at the edge of the driveway, glancing back at the grand mansion that loomed behind him, a symbol of everything he had just left behind. The lights inside were still glowing, the world of wealth and privilege continuing on, unaware or unconcerned by the storm that had just erupted within its walls. But for Benjamin, that world felt hollow now, stripped of its illusions. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He took it out and saw a message from his driver, waiting at the end of the long driveway. He hesitated before replying, his mind still reeling from the night's events. Every step away from the house felt like a step away from the life he had imagined with Grace, a life that now seemed impossible. He knew he couldn't just leave things hanging like this, couldn't simply walk away without reflecting on what had happened. But the idea of staying, of confronting Grace again, felt like an insurmountable task. He was exhausted, drained by the emotional roller coaster of the evening. All he wanted now was to escape, to clear his mind and figure out what came next. Benjamin typed a quick reply to the driver, confirming he was on his way, then began the slow walk down the driveway. The crisp air was soothing, providing a brief reprieve from the emotional intensity that still clung to him. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to Grace. The look on her face when he had told her it was over, the desperation in her voice as she pleaded for another chance. The memory twisted like a knife in his chest. He loved her. That was undeniable. But love alone wasn't enough to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. The Grace he had seen tonight was not the woman he thought he was going to spend his life with. The Grace he had seen was someone who, despite her good intentions, was deeply entrenched in a world that Benjamin could no longer accept. As he reached the end of the driveway, the headlights of his car came into view, casting long shadows on the pavement. The driver stepped out and opened the door for him, but Benjamin hesitated before getting in. He glanced back up the driveway, his mind racing with what-ifs and could-have-beens. Should he have stayed and fought harder for her? Should he have given her the chance to prove that she could change? The questions tormented him, but deep down, he knew the answer. Some things couldn't be fixed with promises and good intentions. There was too much at stake, too much that had already been lost. Finally, he climbed into the car, settling into the back seat as the driver closed the door behind him. The engine hummed to life, and the car began to roll forward, taking Benjamin further away from the estate, from Grace, and from the future he had once envisioned. As the car wound its way through the quiet streets of the city, Benjamin leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes, trying to block out the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. But the memories kept coming. Snippets of conversations, flashes of Grace's smile, the way she had held his hand and looked into his eyes as they talked about their dreams. It was all slipping away now like sand through his fingers. And the more he tried to hold on, the more it hurt. The car ride felt both endless and too short. Before long, they were pulling up in front of his apartment building, the familiar sight offering a small measure of comfort. Benjamin thanked the driver and stepped out into the cool night, the quietness of the city a stark contrast to the turmoil inside him. As he made his way up to his apartment, each step felt heavier than the last. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time since the evening began, he was alone. Truly alone. The silence of the apartment was oppressive, the echoes of the night's events still ringing in his ears. He walked into the living room and stood there, staring at nothing in particular, just letting the reality of the situation sink in. The future he had been building in his mind, the future with Grace, was gone, shattered by the harsh truth he had uncovered. Benjamin sank into the couch, burying his face in his hands. The weight of everything pressed down on him, a crushing sense of loss and heartbreak that he couldn't escape. He had known this would be hard, but nothing could have prepared him for the emptiness he felt now. He didn't know how long he sat there, lost in the darkness of his thoughts, but eventually, the numbness began to creep in, dulling the edges of his pain. He knew that he would have to face the world again, that life would go on, but at this moment, he couldn't see how. All he could feel was the void left by Grace's absence, a void that seemed impossible to fill. The night wore on, and slowly, the exhaustion overtook him. Benjamin fell asleep on the couch, still dressed in his clothes from the evening, the events of the night playing over and over in his dreams. But even in sleep, there was no escape from the reality he had uncovered, no escape from the truth that had broken his heart. When he awoke in the early hours of the morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light through the windows. The world outside was waking up, but for Benjamin, it felt like everything had come to a standstill. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes as he tried to shake off the remnants of sleep. But the emptiness was still there, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He knew that today would be the first day of a new chapter, one without Grace. It was a thought that filled him with both dread and a strange sense of resolve. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. Benjamin stood up, taking a deep breath as he tried to steel himself for what lay ahead. The road wasn't going to be easy, and the wounds from the night before would take a long time to heal. But he had faced the truth, And that was the first step. As he looked out the window at the city below, Benjamin knew that he would find a way to move forward, no matter how hard it would be. Because in the end, he had chosen integrity over comfort, truth over illusion. And that, he realized, was something he could live with, even if it meant walking away from the woman he loved. The days that followed were a blur for Benjamin, filled with a hollow routine that barely kept him grounded. He threw himself into work, burying the pain of the breakup under endless meetings, project deadlines, and late nights at the office. His company was thriving, and his employees admired his dedication. But beneath the surface, Benjamin was adrift. The decision to end things with Grace had been necessary. He knew that. But the loss weighed on him heavily, a constant ache that lingered in the quiet moments. The nights were the hardest, when the distractions of the day faded away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The emptiness of his apartment seemed to echo with the memories of Grace. Her laughter, her touch, the way she'd look at him with those eyes that once held so much promise. But now, those promises felt like distant dreams, shattered by the harsh reality he had uncovered. Benjamin tried not to think about her, tried to push the memories away, but it was impossible to avoid them entirely. She had been a part of his life, a part of his heart, and moving on wasn't going to be as simple as cutting ties. One evening, after another long day at the office, Benjamin returned home to find a small package waiting for him on his doorstep. He frowned, not expecting any deliveries, and picked it up cautiously. There was no return address, but he recognized the handwriting on the label immediately Grace's. His heart skipped a beat as he carried the package inside, setting it down on the kitchen counter. He hesitated, staring at it for a long moment before finally opening it. Inside was a neatly wrapped box with a card placed on top. Benjamin's hands shook slightly as he picked up the card, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions. He opened it and began to read. "Dear Ben, I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night, and I know that nothing I say can change what happened. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Sorry for not being the person you needed me to be. Sorry for the way things ended between us. I've realized that I have a lot of work to do on myself, on the way I see the world. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I understand if you don't want to have anything to do with me anymore. But I wanted to send you something that might help bring some closure. This box holds some of the memories we shared, things that I know you valued, things that I valued too. I hope that, in time, you can look back on our time together with something other than pain. I wish you all the best, Ben. You deserve happiness, and I'm sorry I couldn't be the one to give it to you. Grace." Benjamin's eyes blurred with unshed tears as he finished reading the card. The words were sincere, filled with regret and a deep sadness that mirrored his own. He set the card down, his hands lingering over the box before he finally unwrapped it. Inside were items that carried the weight of their shared history. A framed photo of the two of them on a trip to the Hamptons, a small book of poems they had read together on quiet nights, the concert ticket stubs from their first date. Each item was a reminder of the love they had once shared, a love that had been real despite the painful end. Benjamin took out the photo, his fingers brushing over the glass as he remembered the day it was taken. They had been so happy, so carefree, unaware of the storm that would later tear them apart. He set the photo aside and picked up the book of poems, flipping through the pages until he found the one that Grace had always loved. The words felt bittersweet now, filled with a longing that resonated deeply with his own emotions. For a long time, Benjamin sat there, surrounded by the memories of his relationship with Grace. The pain was still there, sharp and unforgiving. But there was something else now, an understanding that what they had shared hadn't been entirely lost. It had been real, flawed but real, and that was something he could hold on to. The box was a gesture of closure, but it was also an olive branch, a way for Grace to say goodbye while acknowledging the good they had shared. Benjamin knew that moving on would take time, that healing was a process that couldn't be rushed. But as he placed the items back in the box, carefully closing the lid, he felt a small measure of peace. He stood up, carrying the box to his bedroom, where he placed it on a shelf. It wasn't a shrine to the past, but rather a reminder of a chapter in his life that had shaped him, for better or worse. As he looked at the box one last time, He knew that this was the beginning of his journey forward, the first step toward letting go. In the days that followed, Benjamin started to make small changes in his life. He reached out to old friends he had neglected, began to take time for himself outside of work, and even started a new hobby, something to keep his mind engaged and his heart open to new possibilities. Grace's message had been a catalyst, a reminder that he wasn't alone in his grief. She was going through her own process of self-discovery, and while their paths had diverged, he hoped she would find the peace she was searching for. One afternoon, a few weeks later, as Benjamin sat in a cafe reading a book, he received a text from a mutual friend. The message was simple. Grace is leaving New York. She's going to take some time to travel, to figure things out. Benjamin stared at the message for a long moment, a strange mix of emotions washing over him. He hadn't seen or spoken to Grace since that night, and while a part of him wanted to reach out, to talk to her one last time, he knew that this was her journey to make. She needed to find herself, just as he needed to find his own way forward. He typed a quick reply, "Thanks for letting me know," and then set his phone down, staring out the window at the bustling city street. New York had a way of moving on, of pushing forward no matter what, and Benjamin knew he had to do the same. As he watched people pass by, living their lives, he felt a sense of resolve settling in. The pain of losing Grace would always be a part of him, but it didn't have to define him. He had the strength to rebuild, to create a new future for himself, one that wasn't tied to the past. Benjamin took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few weeks begin to lift. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready to move on, ready to see what the future held. And as he picked up his book and began to read again, he knew that whatever came next, he would face it with an open heart. As weeks turned into months, the sharp edges of Benjamin's heartbreak began to soften. The pain was still there, but it had become a quiet ache, something he had learned to live with rather than something that dominated his every thought. His life had settled into a new rhythm, one that no longer revolved around the future he had once envisioned with Grace. Benjamin had thrown himself into his work after the breakup, but as time passed, he realized that it wasn't enough to fill the void. He needed something more, something that would reignite the passion and joy he had lost along the way. So he began to explore new interests, pushing himself out of his comfort zone in ways he hadn't before. One of those interests was painting. It was something he had dabbled in as a child, but had long since abandoned in the pursuit of his career. Now, with time on his hands and a desire to reconnect with the creative side of himself, Benjamin found himself drawn back to it. He set up a small studio in the spare room of his apartment, filling it with canvases, paints, and brushes. At first, it was just a way to pass the time, an outlet for the emotions he still struggled to express. But as he spent more hours in the studio, he found that painting became a form of therapy, a way to process everything he had been through. Each brushstroke was a release, each color a reflection of his evolving state of mind. His early pieces were dark, filled with deep blues and grays that mirrored the sorrow and confusion he had felt after the breakup. But gradually, as he worked through his emotions, his paintings began to change. Lighter colors started to appear, soft yellows, gentle greens, and warm oranges, signaling the emergence of hope and renewal. One afternoon, while he was working on a new piece, Benjamin's phone buzzed with a text. It was from Daniel, an old college friend who had recently moved back to New York. They hadn't seen each other in years, but Daniel had reached out a few weeks ago, and they had reconnected over drinks. Since then, they had started hanging out more regularly, and Benjamin found that their friendship was a welcome distraction from his solitary routine. "Hey Ben," the text read. "A group of us are going hiking upstate this weekend. You in?" Benjamin stared at the message, his mind drifting back to the times he and Grace had talked about taking a trip to the mountains, something they had never gotten around to. The thought brought a pang of sadness, but it was quickly followed by a resolve. This wasn't about the past. It was about moving forward. He quickly replied, "Count me in. Sounds like fun." The weekend came, and Benjamin found himself surrounded by nature, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs as he hiked alongside Daniel and a few others. The trail was challenging, winding through dense forests and up steep inclines, but it was exactly what Benjamin needed. a physical challenge that demanded his full attention, leaving little room for the lingering thoughts of Grace. As they reached the summit, the group paused to take in the breathtaking view of the valley below. The trees were ablaze with fall colors, a vibrant mix of reds, oranges, and yellows that stretched as far as the eye could see. Benjamin felt a sense of peace wash over him as he stood there, the wind ruffling his hair, the sun warm on his face. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly present, connected to the world around him rather than lost in his own thoughts. It was a reminder that life went on, that there was beauty to be found even after the darkest of times. As they made their way back down the mountain, Benjamin struck up a conversation with one of the hikers, a woman named Claire. She was an architect, originally from San Francisco, and they quickly discovered a shared interest in art and design. Their conversation flowed easily, and by the time they reached the base of the trail, Benjamin found himself genuinely enjoying her company. Later, as the group gathered around a campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, Benjamin felt something he hadn't felt in months, a spark of excitement about the future. He and Claire continued to talk, exchanging numbers and making plans to visit an art exhibit together the following week. That night, as Benjamin lay in his tent, staring up at the stars through the mesh roof, he thought about how much had changed since that night at the Thompson estate. He had been lost, heartbroken, and unsure of what direction his life would take. But now, as he looked back on it, he could see how those painful experiences had shaped him, pushing him to grow in ways he never expected. The pain was still there, a quiet reminder of what he had been through, but it no longer defined him. He had found new passions, rekindled old friendships, and opened himself up to new possibilities. And in the process, he had discovered a resilience within himself that he hadn't known was there. When Benjamin returned to the city, he continued to explore these new avenues, diving deeper into his painting, spending more time with friends, and even going on a few dates with Claire. It wasn't about replacing Grace or forgetting the past. It was about building a new future, one that was true to who he was now. As the months passed, Benjamin's life slowly began to take on a new shape. His career continued to thrive, but it was no longer the sole focus of his energy. He found fulfillment in his creative pursuits, in the connections he was rebuilding with others, and in the simple joys of everyday life. One evening, as he was tidying up his studio, Benjamin found himself looking at the box Grace had sent him. It had been sitting on the shelf, untouched since that first night. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled it down, opening the lid. Inside, the memories still lay neatly arranged, but they no longer carried the same weight of sadness they once had. Benjamin smiled softly as he looked through the items, feeling a sense of gratitude for the time he had spent with Grace, despite the way it had ended. Those memories were a part of him, but they no longer held him back. He carefully closed the box and returned it to the shelf, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of how far he had come. As he stood there, in the quiet of his studio, Benjamin felt a sense of contentment that had eluded him for so long. He had found a new path, and while it was different from the one he had once imagined, it was no less fulfilling. Life, he realized, was about embracing change, about letting go of what was and making room for what could be. And as he picked up his brush and began to paint once more, Benjamin knew that he was ready for whatever came next. As the year unfolded, Benjamin's life settled into a new normal, one marked by a balance he hadn't experienced in a long time. His days were no longer consumed solely by work, and his nights were spent in creative pursuits, surrounded by friends who had become like a second family. The past was no longer a shadow looming over him, but rather a chapter that had been read, learned from, and left behind. Benjamin's relationship with Claire had blossomed into something more than just casual dates and shared interests. They had started spending more time together, exploring the city's art scene, hiking on weekends, and enjoying quiet evenings in each other's company. It wasn't the intense, all-consuming love he had once felt for Grace, but it was something steady and comforting, built on mutual respect and understanding. Claire knew about his past, and she never pushed him to move faster than he was ready. Their relationship was a slow burn, warm and reassuring. One evening, after attending a gallery opening downtown, Benjamin and Claire found themselves at a small, cozy cafe, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city. They sat in a corner booth, the soft glow of candlelight casting a warm light over their table. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did between them, ranging from the art they had just seen to their plans for the weekend. But as the night wore on, Benjamin noticed a shift in Claire's demeanor. She seemed a little more reserved, her gaze lingering on him with an intensity that hadn't been there before. Finally, she took a deep breath and met his eyes. "Ben, there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about," she began, her voice steady but soft. Benjamin set down his coffee cup, his curiosity piqued. "What's on your mind?" Claire hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I've been offered a job, a really amazing opportunity. Actually, it's with an architecture firm in San Francisco. They want me to head up a new project, something big." The news hit Benjamin like a sudden gust of wind, unexpected and disorienting. San Francisco was across the country, thousands of miles away from the life they had built here. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but he could feel his heart sinking. Wow, Claire, that's incredible," he managed to say, forcing a smile. "Congratulations." Claire reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Thank you. It's something I've been working toward for a long time, and I'm really excited about it." But she trailed off, her thumb brushing gently over his knuckles. "It's not an easy decision. It would mean leaving New York, leaving everything and everyone here." Benjamin squeezed her hand, understanding the unspoken question in her words. This was a turning point, a crossroads in their relationship. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the same conflict he felt within himself. Claire had become a significant part of his life, and the thought of losing her was painful. But at the same time, he knew how important this opportunity was for her. "What are you thinking?" he asked, keeping his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. Claire sighed, looking down at their joined hands. "I'm thinking that I don't want to lose what we have, but I also don't want to hold either of us back. I know you've gone through a lot this past year, and I don't want to make things harder for you. But at the same time, this is something I've always dreamed of." Benjamin nodded slowly, taking in her words. He had been here before, at a similar crossroads, where choices about the future had to be made. But this time was different. This time, he had to weigh not just his own desires, but hers as well. "Claire," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I care about you a lot, and I want you to be happy. If this job is what you want, you should take it. You've worked hard for this, and I would never want to stand in the way of your dreams." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and sadness. "But what about us, Ben? What happens to us?" Benjamin felt a tightness in his chest as he considered the question. He had learned the hard way that sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest. "I don't know," he admitted. "Long distance is tough, and I don't want to make promises I can't keep. But I think we owe it to ourselves to try. Maybe this can work if we're both willing to put in the effort." Claire nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think so too. And if it doesn't, well, we'll figure it out together." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. Benjamin couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu, recalling the decisions he had made with Grace, decisions that had ultimately led to heartbreak. But he also knew that this was different. Claire was different. Their relationship was built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, and that gave him hope that they could navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. "I'll support whatever you decide, Claire," Benjamin said finally. "Whether that means making this work or finding a way to move forward separately, I want you to know that I'm here for you." Claire smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Ben. That means more to me than you know." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of quiet conversation and shared moments, the weight of the decision hanging over them both. When they finally left the cafe, the cool night air felt heavy with the unspoken future they were both imagining. Over the next few weeks, Claire wrestled with her decision, torn between the opportunity in San Francisco and the life she had begun to build in New York. Benjamin gave her the space she needed, though it was difficult to remain detached as he watched her struggle. He knew that whatever choice she made, it would have a profound impact on their relationship. Then, one evening, as they sat together in Benjamin's apartment, Claire finally made her decision. "I'm going to take the job," she said, her voice firm but tinged with sadness. "I have to see where this takes me, Ben." Benjamin nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. "I understand, and I'm proud of you for going after what you want." They spent the rest of the evening talking about the logistics of the move, discussing plans for visits and how they would stay in touch. It was a bittersweet conversation, filled with both hope and uncertainty. But as they talked, Benjamin felt a sense of closure settling in. This wasn't the end, just another chapter in their lives. The day Claire left for San Francisco was a somber one. Benjamin helped her pack up the last of her things, then drove her to the airport. As they stood together in the terminal, holding hands for what felt like the last time, Benjamin found himself at a loss for words. He wanted to tell her how much she meant to him, how much he would miss her, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, he pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close, as if trying to memorize the feel of her in his arms. "Take care of yourself, Claire," he whispered into her hair. "And don't forget that I'm here if you ever need me." She pulled back slightly, looking up at him with teary eyes. "I won't forget, Ben. Thank you for everything." They kissed one last time, a lingering, tender goodbye, before she turned and walked through the security gate. Benjamin watched her go, his heart aching with the loss, but also filled with a strange sense of peace. He had done the right thing. He had let her go so that she could follow her dreams. As he left the airport and drove back to the city, Benjamin reflected on how much had changed in the past year. He had experienced loss and heartbreak, but he had also found new beginnings, new friendships, and a deeper understanding of himself. Life had a way of moving on, even when it felt like everything was falling apart. In the days that followed, Benjamin returned to his routine, throwing himself back into his work and his art. The pain of Claire's departure was fresh, but it wasn't overwhelming. He had learned to live with loss, to accept that some things were beyond his control. And as he stood in his studio one evening, staring at a blank canvas, Benjamin realized that the future was still wide open. He had no idea what it would bring, but he was ready to face it, one brushstroke at a time. As the weeks rolled on, Benjamin found himself adjusting to the rhythm of life without Claire. The apartment felt emptier, the silence more pronounced, but he had grown accustomed to these transitions. Life had taught him that change was inevitable, and rather than resist it, he had learned to embrace it. One evening, Benjamin stood in front of a large canvas in his studio. The painting was almost finished, a vibrant explosion of colors that reflected the myriad emotions he had experienced over the past year. The deep blues and purples of the background represented the sorrow and loss, while the bright oranges and yellows that swirled across the canvas symbolized hope, renewal, and the possibilities that lay ahead. As he added the final touches, Benjamin's thoughts drifted back to the journey that had brought him here. The breakup with Grace had been the catalyst for so much change, painful, yes, but also transformative. It had pushed him to rediscover parts of himself he had neglected, to pursue passions that had been dormant for far too long. He thought of Claire, now miles away in San Francisco, building a new life for herself. Their relationship, though brief, had been meaningful, helping him heal and grow in ways he hadn't expected. He missed her, of course, but there was no bitterness, no lingering regret. They had parted on good terms, both understanding that their paths had diverged, but grateful for the time they had shared. Benjamin stepped back from the canvas, studying his work with a critical eye. The painting was unlike anything he had done before, bold, abstract, and deeply personal. It was a reflection of his journey, a visual diary of the highs and lows he had experienced. And as he looked at it, he felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the art itself. It was a testament to his resilience, his ability to move forward even when the future seemed uncertain. Later that week, Benjamin received an invitation to exhibit his work at a local gallery, a small but respected space known for showcasing emerging artists. The curator had seen some of his paintings at a friend's studio and had been impressed by their emotional depth and unique style. The opportunity was both thrilling and daunting. Benjamin had always painted for himself, never with the intention of sharing his work with the world. But this felt like the right time. The right way to close one chapter and start another. On the night of the exhibition, Benjamin stood among a crowd of friends, fellow artists, and strangers who had come to see his work. The gallery was abuzz with conversation, the walls lined with his paintings, each one telling a different part of his story. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the large, abstract painting he had just completed, its vibrant colors drawing people in, inviting them to feel the emotions that had inspired it. As he moved through the gallery, talking with guests and answering questions about his work, Benjamin felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was more than just an art show. It was a celebration of everything he had overcome, everything he had built out of the rubble of his past. Toward the end of the evening, as the crowd began to thin, Benjamin found himself standing in front of his favorite piece, the one that symbolized the turning point in his journey. He was lost in thought, reflecting on how far he had come, when a familiar voice broke through his reverie. "I thought I might find you here." Benjamin turned to see Claire standing beside him, a warm smile on her face. She looked different, happier, more confident, as if the time apart had done her good. Her presence was both surprising and comforting, like a bridge between the past and the present. "Claire," he said, returning her smile, "I didn't expect to see you here. What brings you back to New York?" "I had some time off and wanted to visit," she replied, her eyes scanning the room. "And when I heard about your exhibition, I couldn't resist coming to see it for myself. Your work is incredible, Ben. I'm so proud of you." Benjamin felt a swell of emotion at her words. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear you say that." They stood together in companionable silence, looking at the painting in front of them. The colors seemed to shift in the light, reflecting the many layers of meaning embedded within the piece. "I've missed this," Claire said quietly, glancing up at him. "Us, I mean, being here, talking like this." Benjamin nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I've missed it too, but I think we both needed the time apart to figure out who we are, what we want." Claire smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Yeah, we did, and I think we've both found our way, in our own time." As they continued to talk, catching up on each other's lives, it became clear that while their relationship had changed, the connection between them had not. They were different people now, shaped by their experiences, but there was still a bond that neither distance nor time had broken. By the end of the night, as the gallery emptied out and the lights dimmed, Benjamin and Claire stood outside, the cool night air wrapping around them. The city was alive with the sounds of traffic and people, a constant hum that filled the silence between them. "So, what's next for you, Ben?" Claire asked, her tone light but curious. Benjamin thought for a moment, then smiled. "I'm not sure yet, but whatever it is, I'm ready for it." Claire nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "You've come a long way, Ben. I'm glad I got to be a part of your journey. And I'm glad you were there too," he replied, his voice sincere. They hugged, a lingering embrace that spoke of friendship, of gratitude, and of the understanding that sometimes people come into your life to help you grow, even if they don't stay forever. As they parted ways, Benjamin felt a sense of closure, not just with Claire, but with everything that had happened over the past year. He had faced his demons, made difficult choices, and come out stronger on the other side. And now, as he walked down the city streets, the night sky stretching endlessly above him, he knew that whatever the future held, he was ready to embrace it. Because life was about more than just the relationships we build or the dreams we chase. It was about the journey we take, the person we become along the way. And in that moment, Benjamin realized that he had finally found peace, not in a person or a place, but in himself. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.